The native Amerindian population of Cuba began to decline after the European discovery of the island by Christopher Columbus in 1492 and following its development as a Spanish colony during the next several centuries. Large numbers of African slaves were imported to work the coffee and sugar plantations, and Havana became the launching point for the annual treasure fleets bound for Spain from Mexico and Peru. Spanish rule eventually provoked an independence movement and occasional rebellions that were harshly suppressed. U.S. intervention during the Spanish-American War in 1898 assisted the Cubans in overthrowing Spanish rule. The Treaty of Paris established Cuban independence from Spain in 1898 and, following 3.5 years of subsequent U.S. military rule, Cuba became an independent republic in 1902, after which the island experienced a string of governments mostly dominated by the military and corrupt politicians. Fidel Castro led a rebel army to victory in 1959. His authoritarian rule held the subsequent regime together for nearly 5 decades. He stepped down as president in February 2008 in favor of his younger brother Raúl Castro. Cuba's communist revolution, with Soviet support, was exported throughout Latin America and Africa during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, handpicked by Raúl Castro to succeed him, was approved as president by the National Assembly and took office on the 19th of April 2018.
The country faced a severe economic downturn in 1990 following the withdrawal of former Soviet subsidies worth $4-6 billion annually. Cuba Times portrays the U.S. embargo, in place since 1961, as the source of its difficulties. Over the past decade, there has been growing communication with the Cuban government to address national interests. As the result of efforts begun in December 2014 to re-establish diplomatic relations with the Cuban government, which was severed in January 1961, the U.S. and Cuba reopened embassies in their respective countries on the 20th of July 2015. However, the embargo remains in place.
Illicit migration of Cuban nationals to the U.S. via maritime and overland routes has been a long-standing challenge. On the 12th of January 2017, the U.S. and Cuba signed a joint statement ending the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy, by which Cuban nationals who reached U.S. soil were permitted to stay, facilitating the repatriation of Cuban migrants. Illicit Cuban migration has since dropped significantly. In February 2017, the U.S. Coast Guard interdicted 1,606 Cuban nationals at sea. Also in February 2017, 20,995 Cuban migrants presented themselves at various land border ports of entry throughout the U.S.
Geography.
Cuba.
Location: Caribbean, island between the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean, 150 kilometers south of Key West, Florida.
Geographic coordinates: 2130 N, 8000W.
Map references: Central America and the Caribbean.
Area, total:
110,860 square kilometers.
Land:
109,820 square kilometers.
Water:
1,040 square kilometers.
Country comparison to the world:
107.
Area, comparative: slightly smaller than Pennsylvania.
Area comparison map.
Area comparison map.
Land boundaries, total:
28.5 kilometers.
Border countries: 1.
U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, 28.5 kilometers.
Note:
Guantanamo Naval Base is leased by the U.S. and remains part of Cuba.
Coastline: 3,735 kilometers.
Maritime claims: territorial sea:
12 m.
Exclusive economic zone:
200 m.
Contiguous zone:
24 m.
Climate: tropical, moderated by trade winds. Dry season: November to April. Rainy season: May to October.
Terrain: mostly flat to rolling plains, with rugged hills and mountains in the southeast.
Elevation: mean elevation:
108 m.
Lowest point:
Caribbean Sea 0 m.
Highest point:
Pico Turquino 1974 m.
Natural resources: cobalt, nickel, iron ore, chromium, copper, salt, timber, silica, petroleum. Arable land:
Land use: agricultural land,
60.3%.
arable land,
33.8%. Permanent crops,
3.6%, /permanent pasture,
22.9%.
forest,
27.3%,
Other,
12.4%,
irrigated land, 8,700 square kilometers.
population distribution, large population clusters found throughout the country, the more significant ones being in the larger towns and cities, particularly the capital of Havana.
Natural hazards. The East Coast is subject to hurricanes from August to November. In general, the country averages about one hurricane every other year. Droughts are common.
Environment, current issues, soil degradation and desertification, brought on by poor farming techniques and natural disasters, are the main environmental problems. Biodiversity loss, deforestation, air and water pollution.
Environment, international agreements, Party to
Antarctic Treaty, biodiversity, climate change, Kyoto Protocol, desertification, endangered species, environmental modification, hazardous wastes, law of the sea, marine dumping, ozone layer protection, ship pollution, wetlands.
Signed, but not ratified.
Marine life conservation.
Geography. Note, largest country in Caribbean and westernmost island of the Greater Antilles.
People and society.
Cuba.
Population, 11,116,396.
Country comparison to the world.
82.
Nationality. Noun.
Cubans.
Adjective.
Cuban.
Ethnic groups. White 64.1%. Mulatto or mixed 26.6%. Black 9.3%.
Note.
Data represent racial self-identification from Cuba's 2012 national census.
Languages. Spanish, official.
Religions. Christian 59.2%. Folk 17.4%. Other 0.4%. Non 23%.
Note.
Data is estimative because no authoritative source on religious affiliation in Cuba.
Age structure, 0-14 years.
16.44%. Male 940,787. Female 886,996.
15-24 years.
12.1%. Male 698,220. Female 646,684.
25-54 years.
43.69%. Male 2,443,190. Female 2,414,119.
55-64 years.
12.54%. Male 677,304. Female 716,704.
65 years and over.
15.22%. Male 773,636. Female 918,756.
Population pyramid.
Population pyramid.
Dependency ratios.
Dependency ratios are a measure of the age structure of a population. They relate the number of individuals that are likely to be economically dependent on the support of others. Dependency ratios contrast the ratio of youths, ages 0 to 14, and the elderly, ages 65 plus, to the number of those in the working age group, ages 15 to 64. Changes in the dependency ratio provide an indication of potential social support requirements resulting from changes in population age structures, as fertility leave. More dependency ratios. Field listing.
Total dependency ratio.
43.3.
Youth dependency ratio.
23.3.
Elderly dependency ratio.
19.9.
Potential support ratio.
5.
Median age, total.
41.8 years.
Male.
40.2 years.
Female.
43.1 years.
Country comparison to the world.
36.
Population growth rate, minus 0.27%.
Country comparison to the world.
215.
Birth rate, 10.6 births out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
185.
Death rate, 8.9 deaths out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
63.
Net migration rate, minus 4.5 migrant, s, out of 1,000 population.
Country comparison to the world.
188.
Population distribution. Large population clusters found throughout the country. The more significant ones being in the larger towns and cities, particularly the capital of Havana.
Urbanization. Urban population.
77% of total population.
Rate of urbanization.
0.14% annual rate of change.
Major urban areas. Population 2.136 million. Havana, capital.
Sex ratio, At birth.
1.06 male every 1 female.
0 14 years.
1.06 male every 1 female.
15 24 years.
1.08 male every 1 female.
25 54 years.
1.01 male every 1 female.
55 64 years.
0.95 male every 1 female.
65 years and over.
0.84 male every 1 female.
Total population.
0.99 male every 1 female.
Maternal mortality rate 39 deaths/100,000 live births.
Country comparison to the world.
106.
Infant mortality rate, total.
4.4 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Male.
4.9 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Female.
3.9 deaths out of 1,000 live births.
Country comparison to the world.
182.
Life expectancy at birth, total population.
78.9 years.
Male.
76.6 years.
Female.
81.4 years.
Country comparison to the world.
56.
Total fertility rate, 1.71 children born/woman.
Country comparison to the world.
170.
Contraceptive prevalence rate, 73.7%.
Health expenditures, 11.1% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
12.
Physicians density, 8.19 physicians out of 1,000 population.
Hospital bed density, 5.2 beds out of 1,000 population.
Drinking water source, improved.
Urban.
96.4% of population.
Rural.
89.8% of population.
Total.
94.9% of population.
Unimproved.
Urban.
3.6% of population.
Rural.
10.2% of population.
Total.
5.1% of population.
Sanitation facility access, improved.
Urban.
94.4% of population.
Rural.
89.1% of population.
Total.
93.2% of population.
Unimproved.
Urban.
5.6% of population.
Rural.
10.9% of population.
Total.
6.8% of population.
HIV/AIDS, adult prevalence rate, 0.4%.
Country comparison to the world.
71.
HIV/AIDS, people living with HIV/AIDS, 30,000.
Country comparison to the world.
72.
HIV/AIDS, deaths, less than 500, less than /voice required equals name equals see a voice Jess. English, England, greater than major infectious diseases less than /voice required equals name equals Ivona to Brian /voice required equals name equals see a voice Jess. English, England, greater than degree of risk less than /voice required equals name equals Ivona to Brian greater than intermediate less than /voice required equals name equals see a voice Jess. English, England, greater than food or waterborne diseases less than /voice required equals name equals Ivona to Brian greater than bacterial diarrhea and hepatitis A less than /voice required equals name equals see a voice Jess. English, England, greater than vector-borne diseases less than /voice required equals name equals Ivona to Brian greater than dengue fever less than /voice.
Note.
Active local transmission of Zika virus by Aedes species mosquitoes has been identified in this country. As of August 2016, it poses an important risk. A large number of cases possible among U.S. citizens if bitten by an infective mosquito. Other less common ways to get Zika are through sex, via blood transfusion, or during pregnancy, in which the pregnant woman passes Zika virus to her fetus.
Obesity, adult prevalence rate, 24.6%.
Country comparison to the world.
56.
Education expenditures, 12.8% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
1.
Literacy, definition.
Age 15 and over can read and write.
Total population.
99.8%.
Male.
99.9%.
Female.
99.8%.
School life expectancy, primary to tertiary education, total.
14 years.
Male.
14 years.
Female.
14 years.
Unemployment, youth ages 15 to 24, total.
6.1%.
Male.
6.4%.
Female.
5.6%.
Country comparison to the world.
160.
People. Note, illicit emigration is a continuing problem. Cubans attempt to depart the island and enter the US using homemade rafts, alien smugglers, direct flights, or falsified visas. Cubans also use non-maritime routes to enter the US, including direct flights to Miami and overland via the southwest border. The number of Cubans migrating to the US surged after the announcement of normalization of US-Cuban relations in late December 2014, but has decreased since the end of the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy on the 12th of January 2017.
Government.
Cuba.
Country name. Conventional long form.
Republic of Cuba.
Conventional short form.
Cuba.
Local long form.
República de Cuba.
Local short form.
Cuba.
Etymology.
Name derives from the Taino-Indian designation for the island, Cobana, meaning great place.
Government type. Communist state.
Capital. Name.
Havana.
Geographic coordinates.
2307N. 8221W.
Time difference.
UTC 5. Same time as Washington, D.C., during Standard Time.
Daylight saving time.
Plus 1 hour, begins second Sunday in March, ends first Sunday in November. Note, Cuba has been known to alter the schedule of DST on short notice in an attempt to conserve electricity for lighting.
Etymology.
The sites of Spanish colonial cities often retained their original Taino names. Habana, the Spanish name for the city, may be based on the name of a local Taino chief, Habaguanex.
Administrative divisions, 15 provinces, provincias, singular, provincia, and 1 special municipality asterisk, municipio especial, Artemisa, Camagüey, Segovia Villa, Cienfuegos, Granma, Guantanamo, Holguín, Isla de la Juventud asterisk, La Habana, Las Tunas, Matanzas, Mayabeque, Pina del Rio, Sancti Spiritus, Santiago de Cuba, Villa Clara.
Independence. The 20th of May 1902, from Spain. The 10th of December 1898, administered by the U.S. from 1898 to 1902, not acknowledged by the Cuban government as a day of independence.
National holiday. Triumph of the Revolution. Liberation Day, the 1st of January, 1959.
Constitution. History.
Several previous, latest drafted the 14th of July 2018, approved by the National Assembly the 22nd of December 2018, approved by referendum the 24th of February 2019.
Amendments.
Proposed by the National Assembly of People's Power. Passage requires approval of at least 2/3 majority of the National Assembly membership. Amendments to constitutional articles on the authorities of the National Assembly, Council of State, or any rights and duties in the Constitution also require approval in a referendum. Constitutional articles on the Cuban political, social, and economic system cannot be amended.
Legal system. Civil law system based on Spanish Civil Code.
International Law Organization participation has not submitted an ICJ jurisdiction declaration. Non-party state to the act.
Citizenship. Citizenship by birth.
Yes.
Citizenship by descent only.
Yes.
Dual citizenship recognized.
No.
Residency requirement for naturalization.
Unknown.
Suffrage. 16 years of age. Universal.
Executive branch. Chief of State.
President of the Council of State and President of the Council of Ministers Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, since the 19th of April 2018. First Vice President of the Council of State and First Vice President of the Council of Ministers Salvador Antonio Valdez Mesa, since the 19th of April 2018. Note: the President is both Chief of State and Head of Government.
Head of Government.
President of the Council of State and President of the Council of Ministers Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, since the 19th of April 2018. First Vice President of the Council of State and First Vice President of the Council of Ministers Salvador Antonio Valdez Mesa, since the 19th of April 2018.
Cabinet.
Council of Ministers proposed by the President of the Council of State and appointed by the National Assembly. It is subordinate to the 31-member Council of State, which is elected by the Assembly to act on its behalf when it is not in session.
Elections/appointments.
President and Vice Presidents indirectly elected by the National Assembly for a 5-year term, may be re-elected for another 5-year term. Election last held on the 19th of April 2018, next to be held in 2023.
Election results.
Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, PCC, elected President. Percent of National Assembly vote -98.8%. Salvador Antonio Valdez Mesa, PCC, elected Vice President. 100% of National Assembly vote minus 100%.
Legislative branch. Description.
Unicameral National Assembly of People's Power or Assembly National del Poder Popular, 605 seats. Members directly elected by absolute majority vote. Members serve 5-year terms. Note: the National Candidature Commission submits a slate of approved candidates. To be elected, candidates must receive more than 50% of valid votes, otherwise the seat remains vacant or the Council of State can declare another election.
Elections.
Last held on the 11th of March 2018. Next to be held in early 2023.
Election results.
Cuba's Communist Party is the only legal party, and officially sanctioned candidates run unopposed. Composition: men 283, women 322, percent of women 53.2%.
Judicial branch. Highest courts.
People's Supreme Court consists of court president, vice president, 41 professional justices, and lay judges. Organization includes the State Council, criminal, civil, administrative, labor, crimes against the state, and military courts.
Judge selection in term of office.
Professional judges elected by the National Assembly are not subject to a specific term. Lay judges nominated by workplace collectives and neighborhood associations and elected by municipal or provincial assemblies. Lay judges appointed for 5-year terms and serve up to 30 days per year.
Subordinate courts.
People's provincial courts, people's regional courts, people's courts.
Political parties and leaders. Cuban Communist Party or PCC, Raul Castro Ruz.
International Organization Participation, ACP, ALBA, UOSIS, SULUC, FAO, G77, IAEA, ICAO, ICC, National Committees, ICRM, IFAT, IFCS, IO, ILO, IMO, IMSO, Interpol, IOC, IAM, Observer, IPU, ISO, ITSO, ITU, ILS, LIA, NAM, OAS, excluded from formal participation since 1962, OpenL, OPCW, PCA, Petrocaribe, PIF, Partner, UN, UNCTAD, UNESCO, UNIDO, Union Latina, UNTO, APU, WCO, WFTU, NGOs, WHO, WIPO, WMO, WTO.
Diplomatic representation in the U.S. Chief of Mission.
Ambassador Jose Ramon Cabanas Rodriguez, since the 17th of September 2015.
Chancery.
2630 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20009.
Telephone.
12027978518.
Fax.
Na.
Consulate. S. General.
Na.
Diplomatic representation from the U.S. Chief of Mission.
Ambassador, vacant, charge d'affaires Maracach, since the 20th of June 2018.
Embassy.
Calzada between L and M Streets, Vedado, Havana.
Mailing address.
Use Embassy Street address.
Telephone.
53 78394100.
Fax.
Na.
Flag description. 5 equal horizontal bands of blue, top, center, and bottom, alternating with white. A red equilateral triangle based on the hoist side bears a white, 5-pointed star in the center. The blue bands refer to the 3 old divisions of the island:
Central, Occidental, and Oriental. The white bands describe the purity of the independence ideal. The triangle symbolizes liberty, equality, and fraternity, while the red color stands for the bloodshed in the independence struggle. The white star, called La Stella Solitaria, the lone star, lights the way to freedom and was taken from the flag of Texas.
Note.
Design similar to the Puerto Rican flag, with the colors of the bands and triangle reversed.
National symbol. S. Royal palm. National colors.
Red, white, blue.
National anthem. Name.
La Baie Misa, the Bayamo song.
Lyrics/music.
Pedro Figueredo.
Note.
Adopted 1940. Pedro Figueredo first performed La Baie Misa in 1868 during the 10 Years' War against the Spanish, a leading figure in the uprising. Figueredo was captured in 1870 and executed by a firing squad. Just prior to the fusillade he is reputed to have shouted, "Mora por la patria es viva," to die for the country is to live, a line from the anthem.
Economy.
Cuba.
Economy. Overview. The government continues to balance the need for loosening its socialist economic system against a desire for firm political control. In April 2011, the government held the first Cuban Communist Party Congress in almost 13 years, during which leaders approved a plan for wide-ranging economic changes. Since then, the government has slowly and incrementally implemented limited economic reforms, including allowing Cubans to buy electronic appliances and cell phones, stay in hotels, and buy and sell used cars. The government has cut state sector jobs as part of the reform process, and it has opened up some retail services to self-employment, leading to the rise of so-called cuentapropistas, or entrepreneurs. More than 500,000 Cuban workers are currently registered as self-employed.
The Cuban regime has updated its economic model to include permitting the private ownership and sale of real estate and new vehicles, allowing private farmers to sell agricultural goods directly to hotels, allowing the creation of non-agricultural cooperatives, adopting a new foreign investment law, and launching a special development zone around the Mariel port.
Since 2016, Cuba has attributed slowed economic growth in part to problems with petroleum product deliveries from Venezuela. Since late 2000, Venezuela provided petroleum products to Cuba on preferential terms, supplying at times nearly 100,000 barrels per day. Cuba paid for their oil, in part, with the services of Cuban personnel in Venezuela, including some 30,000 medical professionals.
GDP, purchasing power parity, $137 billion.
$134.8 billion.
$134.2 billion.
Note:
Data are in 2016 US dollars.
Country comparison to the world.
79.
GDP. Official exchange rate. $93.79 billion.
Note:
Data are in Cuban pesos at 1 cup equals 1 US dollars. Official exchange rate.
GDP. Real growth rate 1.6%.
0.5%.
4.4%.
Country comparison to the world.
167.
GDP per capita. PPP. $12,300.
$12,200.
$12,100.
Note:
Data in 2016 US dollars.
Country comparison to the world.
128.
Gross national saving 11.4% of GDP.
12.3% of GDP.
12.1% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
156.
GDP composition by end use. Household consumption.
57%.
Government consumption.
31.6%.
Investment in fixed capital.
9.6%.
Investment in inventories.
0%.
Exports of goods and services.
14.6%.
Imports of goods and services.
Minus 12.7%.
GDP composition by sector of origin. Agriculture.
4%.
Industry.
22.7%.
Services.
73.4%.
Agriculture products. Sugar, tobacco, citrus, coffee, rice, potatoes, beans, livestock.
Industries. Petroleum, nickel, cobalt, pharmaceuticals, tobacco, construction, steel, cement, agricultural machinery, sugar.
Industrial production growth rate, minus 1.2%.
Country comparison to the world.
179.
Labor force, 4.691 million.
Note:
State sector 72.3%. Non-state sector 27.7%.
Country comparison to the world.
86.
Labor force by occupation. Agriculture.
18%.
Industry.
10%.
Services.
72%.
Unemployment rate. 2.6%.
2.4%.
Note:
Data are official rates. Unofficial estimates are about double.
Country comparison to the world.
27.
Population below poverty line. NA.
Household income or consumption by percentage share. Lowest 10%.
NA.
Highest 10%.
NA.
Budget, revenues.
54.52 billion.
Expenditures.
64.64 billion.
Taxes and other revenues. 58.1% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
8.
Budget surplus. Plus, or deficit. Minus 10.8% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
214.
Public debt, 47.7% of GDP.
42.7% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
110.
Fiscal year, calendar year.
Inflation rate. Consumer prices. 5.5%.
4.5%.
Country comparison to the world.
178.
Central bank discount rate. NA.
Commercial bank prime lending rate. NA.
Stock of narrow money. $23.26 billion.
$21.92 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
66.
Stock of broad money, $23.26 billion.
$21.92 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
66.
Stock of domestic credit, NAR.
Current account balance, $985.4 million.
$2.008 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
50.
Exports, $2.63 billion.
$2.546 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
132.
Exports. Partners, Venezuela 17.8%, Spain 12.2%, Russia 7.9%, Lebanon 6.1%, Indonesia 4.5%, Germany 4.3%.
Exports, commodities, petroleum, nickel, medical products, sugar, tobacco, fish, citrus, coffee.
Imports, $11.06 billion.
$10.28 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
99.
Imports, commodities, petroleum, food, machinery and equipment, chemicals.
Imports, partners, China 22%, Spain 14%, Russia 5%, Brazil 5%, Mexico 4.9%, Italy 4.8%, US 4.5%.
Reserves of foreign exchange and gold, $11.35 billion.
$12.3 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
72.
Debt, external, $30.06 billion.
$29.89 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
80.
Stock of direct foreign investment, at home, now.
Stock of direct foreign investment, abroad, $4.138 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
77.
Exchange rates, Cuban pesos, cup, per US dollar dash.
1.
1.
1.
1.
22.7.
Energy.
Cuba.
Electricity access, population without electricity.
200,000.
Electrification, total population.
99.9%.
Electrification, urban areas.
100%.
Electrification, rural areas.
95%.
Electricity, production, 19.28 billion kWh.
Country comparison to the world.
76.
Electricity consumption, 16.16 billion.
Country comparison to the world.
75.
Electricity, exports, 0 kilowatt hours.
Country comparison to the world.
124.
Electricity imports, 0 kilowatt hours.
Country comparison to the world.
138.
Electricity, installed generating capacity, 6.998 million kW.
Country comparison to the world.
74.
Electricity from fossil fuels, 91% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
53.
Electricity from nuclear fuels, 0% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
75.
Electricity from hydroelectric plants, 1% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
147.
Electricity from other renewable sources, 8% of total installed capacity.
Country comparison to the world.
85.
Crude oil production, 50,000 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
51.
Crude oil, exports, 0 barrel, day.
Country comparison to the world.
111.
Crude oil imports, 112,400 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
41.
Crude oil, proved reserves, 124 million barrel.
Country comparison to the world.
68.
Refined petroleum products production, 104,100 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
67.
Refined petroleum products, consumption, 175,000 barrel, day.
Country comparison to the world.
60.
Refined petroleum products exports, 24,190 barrels/day.
Country comparison to the world.
69.
Refined petroleum products, imports, 52,750 barrel, day.
Country comparison to the world.
78.
Natural gas production, 1.189 billion qm.
Country comparison to the world.
66.
Natural gas, consumption, 1.189 billion cubic meters.
Country comparison to the world.
90.
Natural gas exports, 0 qm.
Country comparison to the world.
90.
Natural gas, imports, 0 cubic meters.
Country comparison to the world.
113.
Natural gas proved reserves 70.79 billion qm.
Country comparison to the world.
57.
Carbon dioxide emissions from consumption of energy. 26.94 million Mount.
Country comparison to the world.
78.
Communications.
Cuba.
Telephones, fixed lines, total subscriptions.
1,349,188.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
12.
Country comparison to the world.
67.
Telephones, mobile cellular, total subscriptions.
4,613,782.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
41.
Country comparison to the world.
123.
Telephone system, general assessment.
Fixed line and mobile services run by the state-run ITSCA. Mobile cellular telephone service is expensive and must be paid in convertible pesos. Cuban government has opened several hundred Wi-Fi hotspots around the island, which are expensive, and launched a new residential internet pilot in Havana and other provinces. Ongoing normalization of relations with the U.S. warrants considerable economic prosperity for Cuba.
Domestic.
Fixed line density remains low at about 12 per 100 inhabitants. Mobile cellular service is expanding to about 41 per 100 persons.
International.
Country code 53. The Alba 1 fiber optic submarine cable links Cuba, Jamaica, and Venezuela. January 2016. The FCC allowed U.S. firms to do business directly with the Cuban telecom sector. The government has looked favorably on proposals for a new subsea cable to link Cuba directly with Florida, which would supplement the only direct international cable access, via the Alba 1 cable from Venezuela, satellite Earth station, 1 into Sputnik, Atlantic Ocean region. Several U.S. telecommunication companies have signed voice and data deals to serve their customers while in Cuba.
Broadcast media. Government owns and controls all broadcast media, with private ownership of electronic media prohibited. However, several online independent news sites exist, and those that are not openly critical of the government are often tolerated. Government operates 5 national TV networks and many local TV stations. Government operates 6 national radio networks, an international station, and many local radio stations. Radio Tomati is beamed from the U.S.
Internet country code .cu.
Internet users, total
4,334,022.
% of population.
38.8%.
Note.
Private citizens are prohibited from buying computers or accessing the Internet without special authorization. Foreigners may access the Internet in large hotels but are subject to firewalls. Some Cubans buy illegal passwords on the black market or take advantage of public outlets to access limited email in the government-controlled intranet.
Country comparison to the world.
83.
Broadband, fixed subscriptions, total
33,536.
Subscriptions per 100 inhabitants.
Less than 1.
Country comparison to the world.
138.
Transportation.
Cuba.
National Air Transport System. Number of registered air carriers.
4.
Inventory of registered aircraft operated by air carriers.
18.
Annual passenger traffic on registered air carriers.
1,294,458.
Annual freight traffic on registered air carriers.
20,919,645 Mount km.
Civil aircraft registration country code prefix CU.
Airports 133.
Country comparison to the world.
42.
Airports with paved runways, total
64.
over 3,047 m.
7.
2,438 to 3,047 m.
10.
1,524 to 2,437 m.
16.
914 to 1,523 m.
4.
Under 914 m.
27.
Airports with unpaved runways, total
69.
914 to 1,523 m.
11.
Under 914 m.
58.
Pipelines, 41 kilometers gas, 230 kilometers oil.
Railways, total
8,367 kilometers.
standard gauge
8,195 kilometers, 1.435 m gauge. 124 kilometers electrified.
Narrow gauge.
172 kilometers 1.000 m gauge.
Note.
70 kilometers of standard gauge track is not for public use.
Country comparison to the world.
26.
Roadways, total.
60,000 kilometers.
Paved.
20,000 kilometers.
Unpaved.
40,000 kilometers.
Country comparison to the world.
63.
Waterways, 240 kilometers. Almost all navigable inland waterways are near the mouths of rivers.
Country comparison to the world.
94.
Merchant marine.
Merchant marine may be defined as all ships engaged in the carriage of goods, or all commercial vessels, as opposed to all non-military ships, which excludes tugs, fishing vessels, offshore oil rigs, etc.
Total.
41.
By type.
General cargo 11, oil tanker 3, other 27.
Country comparison to the world.
120.
Ports and terminals. Major seaport. S.
Antilla, Cienfuegos, Guantanamo, Havana, Matanzas, Mariel, Vitas Bay, Santiago de Cuba.
Military and security.
Cuba.
Military expenditures. 3.08% of GDP.
3.54% of GDP.
3.51% of GDP.
3.94% of GDP.
3.08% of GDP.
Country comparison to the world.
28.
Military branches. Revolutionary Armed Forces. Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, FAR.
Revolutionary Army. Ejército Revolucionario, includes territorial militia troops. Militia de Tropas de Territoriales, MT. Revolutionary Navy. Marina de Guerra Revolucionaria, MGR, includes Marine Corps. Revolutionary Air and Air Defense Forces. Defensas Antiaéreas y Fuerza Revolucionaria, DARFAR. Youth Labor Army. Ejército Juvenil del Trabajo, EJT.
Military service age and obligation. 17-28 years of age for compulsory military service, 2-year service obligation for males, optional for females.
Military. Note, the collapse of the Soviet Union deprived the Cuban military of its major economic and logistic support and had a significant impact on the state of Cuban equipment. The army remains well-trained and professional in nature. The lack of replacement parts for its existing equipment has increasingly affected operational capabilities.
Transnational issues.
Cuba.
Disputes. International. U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay is leased to U.S. and only mutual agreement or U.S. abandonment of the facility can terminate the lease.
Trafficking in persons. Current situation.
Cuba is a source country for adults and children subjected to sex trafficking and forced labor. Child sex trafficking and child sex tourism occur in Cuba. While some Cubans are forced into prostitution in South America and the Caribbean, allegations have been made that some Cubans have been forced or coerced to work at Cuban medical missions abroad. Assessing the scope of trafficking within Cuba is difficult because of the lack of information.
Tier rating.
Tier 2 watch list. Cuba does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, however, it is making significant efforts to do so. Cuba's penal code does not criminalize all forms of human trafficking, but the government reported that it is in the process of amending its criminal code to comply with the 2000 UN TIP protocol, to which it acceded in 2013. The government in 2014 prosecuted and convicted 13 sex traffickers and provided services to the victims in those cases but does not have shelters specifically for trafficking victims. The government did not recognize forced labor as a problem and took no action to address it. State media produced newspaper articles and TV and radio programs to raise public awareness about sex trafficking.
Cuba.
Officially there.
Republic of Cuba.
Less than greater than is a country comprising the island of Cuba as well as Isla de la Juventud and several minor archipelagos. Cuba is located in the northern Caribbean where the Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean meet. It is east of the Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico, south of both the U.S. state of Florida and the Bahamas, west of Haiti and north of both Jamaica and the Cayman Islands. Havana is the largest city and capital. Other major cities include Santiago de Cuba and Camagüey. The area of the Republic of Cuba is without the territorial waters. The island of Cuba is the largest island in Cuba and in the Caribbean, with an area of, and the second most populous after Hispaniola, with over 11 million inhabitants. The territory that is now Cuba was inhabited by the Siboney Taino people from the 4th and NBSP-millennium and NBSP-BC until Spanish colonization in the 15th century. From the 15th century, it was a colony of Spain until the Spanish-American War of 1898, when Cuba was occupied by the United States and gained nominal independence as a
de facto
United States protectorate in 1902. As a fragile republic, in 1940 Cuba attempted to strengthen its democratic system, but mounting political radicalization and social strife culminated in a coup and subsequent dictatorship under Fulgencio Batista in 1952. Open corruption and oppression under Batista's rule led to his ousting in January 1959 by the 26th of July movement, which afterwards established communist rule under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Since 1965, the state has been governed by the Communist Party of Cuba. The country was a point of contention during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and a nuclear war nearly broke out during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Cuba is one of few Marxist-Leninist socialist states where the role of the vanguard Communist Party is enshrined in the Constitution. Independent observers have accused the Cuban government of numerous human rights abuses, including arbitrary imprisonment. Culturally, Cuba is considered part of Latin America. It is a multi-ethnic country whose people, culture and customs derive from diverse origins, including the Aboriginal Taino and Siboney peoples, the long period of Spanish colonialism, the introduction of African slaves and a close relationship with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Cuba is a sovereign state and a founding member of the United Nations, the G77, the Non-Aligned Movement, the African, Caribbean and Pacific Group of States, ALBA and Organization of American States. The country is a regional power in Latin America and a middle power in world affairs. It has currently one of the world's only planned economies, and its economy is dominated by the exports of sugar, tobacco, coffee and skilled labor. According to the Human Development Index, Cuba has high human development and is ranked the 8th highest in North America, though 67th in the world. It also ranks highly in some metrics of national performance, including healthcare and education. It is the only country in the world to meet the conditions of sustainable development put forth by the WWF.
Etymology.
Less than linked greater than historians believe the name
Cuba
comes from the Taino language, however its exact derivation is unknown. The exact meaning of the name is unclear, but it may be translated either as where fertile land is abundant,
Cubao,
or great place,
Cobana.
Fringe theory writers who believe that Christopher Columbus was Portuguese state that
Cuba
was named by Columbus for the town of Cuba in the district of Biju in Portugal.
History. Pre-Columbian era.
Before the arrival of the Spanish, Cuba was inhabited by three distinct tribes of indigenous peoples of the Americas: the Taino and Arawak people, the Guanahitabi and the Siboney people. The ancestors of the Siboney migrated from the mainland of South America, with the earliest sites dated to 5000 BP. The Taino arrived from Hispaniola sometime in the 3rd century AD. When Columbus arrived, they were the dominant culture in Cuba, having an estimated population of 150,000. Christopher Columbus commanded his 3 ships,
La Pinta, La Nina,
and there
Santa Maria,
to land on Cuba's northeastern coast on the 28th of October 1492. This was near what is now Barrio, Holguin province. Columbus claimed the island for the new kingdom of Spain and named it
Iloana
after Juan, Prince of Asturias. In 1511, the first Spanish settlement was founded by Diego Velázquez de Cuellar at Baracoa. Other towns soon followed, including San Cristobal de la Habana, founded in 1515, which later became the capital. The native Taino were forced to work under the encomienda system, which resembled a feudal system in medieval Europe. Within a century, the indigenous people were virtually wiped out due to multiple factors, primarily Eurasian infectious diseases, to which they had no natural resistance immunity, aggravated by harsh conditions of the repressive colonial subjugation. In 1529, a measles outbreak in Cuba killed 2/3 of those few natives who had previously survived smallpox. On the 18th of May 1539, Conquistador Hernando de Soto departed from Havana at the head of some 600 followers into a vast expedition through the southeastern United States, starting at La Florida, in search of gold, treasure, fame and power. On the 1st of September 1548, Dr. Gonzalo Perez de Angulo was appointed governor of Cuba. He arrived in Santiago, Cuba on the 4th of November 1549 and immediately declared the liberty of all natives. He became Cuba's first permanent governor to reside in Havana instead of Santiago, and he built Havana's first church made of masonry. After the French took Havana in 1555, the governor's son, Francisco de Angulo, went to Mexico. Cuba developed slowly and, unlike the plantation islands of the Caribbean, had a diversified agriculture. But what was most important was that the colony developed as an urbanized society that primarily supported the Spanish colonial empire. By the mid-18th century, its colonists held 50,000 slaves, compared to 60,000 in Barbados, 300,000 in Virginia, both British colonies, and 450,000 in French Saint-Domingue, which had large-scale sugarcane plantations. The 7 Years' War, which erupted in 1754 across 3 continents, eventually arrived in the Spanish Caribbean. Spain's alliance with the French pitched them into direct conflict with the British, and in 1762 a British expedition of 5 warships and 4,000 troops set out from Portsmouth to capture Cuba. The British arrived on 6 June, and by August had Havana under siege. When Havana surrendered, the admiral of the British fleet, George Pocock, and the commander of the land forces, George Keppel, the 3rd Earl of Albemarle, entered the city as a conquering new governor and took control of the whole western part of the island. The British immediately opened up trade with their North American and Caribbean colonies, causing a rapid transformation of Cuban society. They imported food, horses and other goods into the city, as well as thousands of slaves from West Africa to work on the underdeveloped sugar plantations. As the historian Ada Ferrer has written, at a basic level, liberation in Saint-Domingue helped entrench its denial in Cuba. As slavery and colonialism collapsed in the French colony, the Spanish island underwent transformations that were almost the mirror image of Haiti's. Estimates suggest that between 1790 and 1820 some 325,000 Africans were imported to Cuba as slaves, which was 4 times the amount that had arrived between 1760 and 1790. Although a smaller proportion of the population of Cuba was enslaved, at times slaves arose in revolt. In 1812 the Appunti-slave rebellion took place, but it was suppressed. The population of Cuba in 1817 was 630,980, of which 291,021 were white, 115,691 free people of color mixed race, and 224,268 black slaves. This was a much higher proportion of free blacks to slaves than in Virginia, for instance, or the other Caribbean islands. Historians such as Swedish Magnus Morner, who studied slavery in Latin America, found that manumissions increased when slave economies were in decline, as in 18th century Cuba and early 19th century Maryland of the United States. In part due to Cuban slaves working primarily in urbanized settings, by the 19th century, they had developed the practice of
coartation,
or buying oneself out of slavery, a uniquely Cuban development, according to historian Herbert S. Klein. Due to a shortage of white labor, blacks dominated urban industries to such an extent that when whites in large numbers came to Cuba in the middle of the 19th century, they were unable to displace Negro workers. The United States declined to recognize the new Cuban government, although many European and Latin American nations did so. In 1878, the Pact of Zanjan ended the conflict, with Spain promising greater autonomy to Cuba. In 1879 to 1880, Cuban patriot Calixto Garcia attempted to start another war known as the Little War but did not receive enough support. Slavery in Cuba was abolished in 1875, but the process was completed only in 1886. An exiled dissident named José Martí founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party in New York in 1892. The aim of the party was to achieve Cuban independence from Spain. In January 1895 Martí traveled to Montecristi and Santo Domingo to join the efforts of Máximo Gómez. Fighting against the Spanish army began in Cuba on the 24th of February 1895, but Martí was unable to reach Cuba until the 11th of April 1895. Between 200,000 and 400,000 Cuban civilians died from starvation and disease in the camps, numbers verified by the Red Cross and United States Senator Redfield Proctor, a former Secretary of War. American and European protests against Spanish conduct on the island followed. The U.S. battleship
Maine
was sent to protect U.S. interests, but soon after arrival, it exploded in Havana harbor and sank quickly, killing nearly three-quarters of the crew. The cause and responsibility for the sinking of the ship remained unclear after a board of inquiry. Popular opinion in the U.S., fueled by an active press, concluded that the Spanish were to blame and demanded action. Spain and the United States declared war on each other in late April 1898. Over the previous decades, 5 U.S. presidents, Polk, Pierce, Buchanan, Grant, and McKinley, had tried to buy the island of Cuba from Spain.
Republic 1902 to 59 equals first years 1902 to 1925
equals after the Spanish-American War, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris 1898, by which Spain ceded Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam to the United States for the sum of, and Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. Cuba gained formal independence from the U.S. on the 20th of May 1902, as the Republic of Cuba. Under Cuba's new constitution, the U.S. retained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and to supervise its finances and foreign relations. Under the Platt Amendment, the U.S. leased the Guantanamo Bay naval base from Cuba. Following disputed elections in 1906, the first president, Thomas Estrada Palmer, faced an armed revolt by Independence War veterans who defeated the meager government forces. The U.S. intervened by occupying Cuba and named Charles Edward Magoon as governor for 3 years. Cuban historians have characterized Magoon's governorship as having introduced political and social corruption. In 1908, self-government was restored when José Miguel Gómez was elected president, but the U.S. continued intervening in Cuban affairs. In 1912, the Partido Independiente de Color attempted to establish a separate black republic in Oriente province, but was suppressed by General Monteagudo with considerable bloodshed. In 1924, Gerardo Mercado was elected president. The Wall Street crash of 1929 led to a collapse in the price of sugar, political unrest, and repression. Uprisings among sugar workers, and an army revolt forced Mercado into exile in August 1933. He was replaced by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y Quezada.
Equals Revolution of 1933 to 1940.
Equals in September 1933, the Sergeants' Revolt, led by Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, overthrew Céspedes. A 5-member executive committee, the Pentache of 1933, was chosen to head a provisional government. Ramon Grau San Martin was then appointed as provisional president. On balance, during the period 1933 to 1940, Cuba suffered from fragile politic structures, reflected in the fact that it saw 3 different presidents in 2 years, 1935 to 1936. And in the militaristic and repressive policies of Batista as head of the army.
Equals Constitution of 1940.
Equals a new constitution was adopted in 1940, which engineered radical progressive ideas, including the right to labor and health care. Batista was elected president in the same year, holding the post until 1944. He is so far the only non-white Cuban to win the nation's highest political office. His government carried out major social reforms. Several members of the Communist Party held office under his administration. Cuban armed forces were not greatly involved in combat during World War and NBSP, too, though President Batista did suggest to join U.S. Latin American assault on Francoist Spain to overthrow its authoritarian regime. Batista adhered to the 1940 Constitution's strictures preventing his re-election. Ramon Grau San Martin was the winner of the next election. In 1944, Carlos Prio Socaras, a protege of Grau, became president in 1948. After finishing his term in 1944, Batista lived in Florida, returning to Cuba to run for president in 1952. Facing certain electoral defeat, he led a military coup that preempted the election. Back in power, and receiving financial, military, and logistical support from the United States government, Batista suspended the 1940 Constitution and revoked most political liberties, including the right to strike. He then aligned with the wealthiest landowners who owned the largest sugar plantations, and presided over a stagnating economy that widened the gap between rich and poor Cubans. Batista outlawed the Cuban Communist Party in 1952. After the coup, Cuba had Latin America's highest per capita consumption rates of meat, vegetables, cereals, automobiles, telephones and radios, though about one-third of the population was considered poor and enjoyed relatively little of this consumption. In 1958, Cuba was a relatively well-advanced country by Latin American standards, and in some cases by world standards. On the other hand, Cuba was affected by perhaps the largest labor union privileges in Latin America, including bans on dismissals and mechanization. They were obtained in large measure at the cost of the unemployed and the peasants, leading to disparities. Between 1933 and 1958, Cuba extended economic regulations enormously, causing economic problems. Unemployment became a problem as graduates entering the workforce could not find jobs.
Revolution and Communist Party rule 1959-present.
In the 1950s, various organizations, including some advocating armed uprising, competed for public support in bringing about political change. In 1956, Fidel Castro and about 80 supporters landed from the yacht
Granma
in an attempt to start a rebellion against the Batista government. From 1959 to 1966, Cuban insurgents fought a 6-year rebellion in the Escambray Mountains against the Castro government. The government's vastly superior numbers eventually crushed the insurgency. The rebellion lasted longer and involved more soldiers than the Cuban Revolution. The United States Department of State has estimated that 3,200 people were executed from 1959 to 1962. According to Amnesty International, official death sentences from 1959 to 87 numbered 237, of which all but 21 were actually carried out. Other estimates for the total number of political executions range from 4,000 to 33,000. The vast majority of those executed directly following the 1959 revolution were policemen, politicians, and informers of the Batista regime accused of crimes such as torture and murder, and their public trials and executions had widespread popular support among the Cuban population. The United States government initially reacted favorably to the Cuban Revolution, seeing it as part of a movement to bring democracy to Latin America. Castro's legalization of the Communist Party and the hundreds of executions of Batista agents, policemen and soldiers that followed caused a deterioration in the relationship between the two countries. In February 1960, Castro signed a commercial agreement with Soviet Vice Premier Anastas Mikoyan. The invasion known as the Bay of Pigs invasion took place on the 14th of April 1961, during the term of President John F. Kennedy. In January 1962, Cuba was suspended from the Organization of American States (OAS), and later the same year the OAS started to impose sanctions against Cuba of similar nature to the U.S. sanctions. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in October 1962. By 1963, Cuba was moving towards a full-fledged communist system modeled on the USSR. During the 1970s, Fidel Castro dispatched tens of thousands of troops in support of Soviet-supported wars in Africa. He supported the MPLA in Angola and Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia. The standard of living in the 1970s was extremely Spartan and discontent was rife. Fidel Castro admitted the failures of economic policies in a 1970 speech. The government did not accept American donations of food, medicines, and cash until 1993. Cuba has since found a new source of aid and support in the People's Republic of China. In addition, Hugo Chavez, then president of Venezuela, and Evo Morales, president of Bolivia, became allies, and both countries are major oil and gas exporters. In 2003, the government arrested and imprisoned a large number of civil activists, a period known as the Black Spring. In February 2008, Fidel Castro announced his resignation as president of Cuba. On 24 February his brother, Raúl Castro, was declared the new president. In his inauguration speech, Raúl promised that some of the restrictions on freedom in Cuba would be removed. In March 2009, Raúl Castro removed some of his brother's appointees. On the 3rd of June 2009,
Until now, Cubans had to pay $150 for an exit visa. A resident in the country that the Cuban wanted to visit would also have to write a letter of invitation. Fees associated with the letter ran as high as $200. That's a steep price in a country where the average official monthly income is about $20.
In 1961 the Cuban government had imposed broad restrictions on travel to prevent the mass emigration of people after the 1959 revolution. It approved exit visas only on rare occasions. Requirements were simplified. Cubans need only a passport and a national ID card to leave, and they are allowed to take their young children with them for the first time. However, a passport costs on average 5 months' salary. Observers expect that Cubans with paying relatives abroad are most likely to be able to take advantage of the new policy. In the first year of the program, over 180,000 left Cuba and returned. Talks with Cuban officials and American officials, including President Barack Obama, resulted in the release of Alan Gross, 52 political prisoners, and an unnamed non-citizen agent of the United States in return for the release of 3 Cuban agents currently imprisoned in the United States. Additionally, while the embargo between the United States and Cuba was not immediately lifted, it was relaxed to allow import, export, and certain limited commerce.
Government and politics.
The Republic of Cuba is one of the world's last remaining socialist countries following the Marxist-Leninist ideology. The Constitution of 1976, which defined Cuba as a socialist republic, was replaced by the Constitution of 1992, which is guided by the ideas of José Martí and the political and social ideas of Marx, Engels and Lenin. Members of both councils are elected by the National Assembly of People's Power. Article 131 of the Constitution states that voting shall be through free, equal and secret vote. The Communist Party of Cuba has held 6-party Congress meetings since 1975. In 2011, the party stated that there were 800,000 members, and representatives generally constitute at least half of the councils of state and the National Assembly. The remaining positions are filled by candidates nominally without party affiliation. Other political parties campaign and raise finances internationally, while activity within Cuba by opposition groups is minimal. Cuba is considered an authoritarian regime according to the 2016 Democracy Index and 2017 Freedom in the World Survey. In February 2013, Cuban President Raúl Castro announced he would resign in 2018, ending his 5-year term, and that he hopes to implement permanent term limits for future Cuban presidents, including age limits. After Fidel Castro died on the 25th of November 2016, the Cuban government declared a 9-day mourning period. During the mourning period, Cuban citizens were prohibited from playing loud music, partying, and drinking alcohol.
Administrative divisions.
The country is subdivided into 15 provinces and 1 special municipality, Isla de la Juventud. These were formerly part of 6 larger historical provinces, Pinar del Rio, Habana, Matanzas, Las Villas, Camagüey and Oriente. The present subdivisions closely resemble those of the Spanish military provinces during the Cuban Wars of Independence. When the most troublesome areas were subdivided, the provinces are divided into municipalities.
Human rights.
The Cuban government has been accused of numerous human rights abuses including torture, arbitrary imprisonment, unfair trials, and extrajudicial executions, also known as
El Paredon.
Human Rights Watch has stated that the government represses nearly all forms of political dissent and that Cubans are systematically denied basic rights to free expression, association, assembly, privacy, movement, and due process of law. In 2003, the European Union (EU) accused the Cuban government of continuing flagrant violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It has continued to call regularly for social and economic reform in Cuba, along with the unconditional release of all political prisoners. The United States continues an embargo against Cuba so long as it continues to refuse to move toward democratization and greater respect for human rights, though the UN General Assembly has, since 1992, passed a resolution every year condemning the ongoing impact of the embargo and claiming it violates the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Cuba considers the embargo itself a violation of human rights. On the 17th of December 2014, United States President Barack Obama announced the re-establishment of diplomatic relations with Cuba, pushing for Congress to put an end to the embargo. Cuba had the second highest number of imprisoned journalists of any nation in 2008. China had the highest according to various sources, including the Committee to Protect Journalists and Human Rights Watch. Cuban dissidents face arrest and imprisonment. In the 1990s, Human Rights Watch reported that Cuba's extensive prison system, one of the largest in Latin America, consists of 40 maximum security prisons, 30 minimum security prisons, and over 200 work camps. According to Human Rights Watch, Cuba's prison population is confined in substandard and unhealthy conditions, where prisoners face physical and sexual abuse. During the entire period of Castro's rule over the island, an estimated 200,000 people had been imprisoned or deprived of their freedoms for political reasons. Under Castro, Cuba was heavily involved in wars in Africa, Central America and Asia. Cuba supported Algeria in 1961 to 1965, and sent tens of thousands of troops to Angola during the Angolan Civil War. Other countries that featured Cuban involvement include Ethiopia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Yemen. Lesser-known actions include the 1959 missions to the Dominican Republic. The expedition failed, but a prominent monument to its members was erected in their memory in Santo Domingo by the Dominican government, and they feature prominently at the country's Memorial Museum of the Resistance. In 2008, the European Union (EU) and Cuba agreed to resume full relations and cooperation activities. Cuba is a founding member of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. At the end of 2012, tens of thousands of Cuban medical personnel worked abroad, with as many as 30,000 doctors in Venezuela alone via the two countries' Oil for Doctors program. In 1996, the United States, then under President Bill Clinton, brought in the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, better known as the Helms-Burton Act. In 2009, United States President Barack Obama stated on 17 April, in Trinidad and Tobago, that the United States seeks a new beginning with Cuba, and reversed the Bush administration's prohibition on travel and remittances by Cuban Americans from the United States to Cuba. 5 years later, an agreement between the United States and Cuba, popularly called the Cuban Thaw, brokered in part by Canada and Pope Francis, began the process of restoring international relations between the two countries. They agreed to release political prisoners, and the United States began the process of creating an embassy in Havana. This was realized on the 30th of June 2015, when Cuba and the U.S. reached a deal to reopen embassies in their respective capitals on the 20th of July 2015 and re-establish diplomatic relations. Earlier in the same year, the White House announced that President Obama would remove Cuba from the American government's list of nations that sponsor terrorism, which Cuba reportedly welcomed as fair. On the 17th of September 2017, the United States considered closing its Cuban embassy following mysterious sonic attacks on its staff.
Crime and law enforcement.
All law enforcement agencies are maintained under Cuba's Ministry of the Interior, which is supervised by the Revolutionary Armed Forces. In Cuba, citizens can receive police assistance by dialing 106 on their telephones. The police force, which is referred to as Policía Nacional Revolucionaria or PNR, is then expected to provide help. The Cuban government also has an agency called the Intelligence Directorate that conducts intelligence operations and maintains close ties with the Russian Federal Security Service.
Military.
Cuba spent about on its armed forces. In 1985, Cuba devoted more than 10% of its GDP to military expenditures. In response to perceived American aggression, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba built up one of the largest armed forces in Latin America, second only to that of Brazil. From 1975 until the late 1980s, Soviet military assistance enabled Cuba to upgrade its military capabilities. After the loss of Soviet subsidies, Cuba scaled down the numbers of military personnel, from 235,000 in 1994 to about 60,000 in 2003.
Economy.
The Cuban state claims to adhere to socialist principles in organizing its largely state-controlled planned economy. Most of the means of production are owned and run by the government, and most of the labor force is employed by the state. Recent years have seen a trend toward more private sector employment. By 2006, public sector employment was 78% and private sector 22%, compared to 91.8% to 8.2% in 1981. Government spending is 78.1% of GDP. Any firm that hires a Cuban must pay the Cuban government, which in turn pays the employee in Cuban pesos. The average monthly wage is 466 Cuban pesos, about $19. Every Cuban household has a ration book known as Librito, entitling it to a monthly supply of food and other staples, which are provided at nominal cost. Before Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, Cuba was one of the most advanced and successful countries in Latin America. Cuba's capital, Havana, was a glittering and dynamic city. In 2016, the Miami Herald wrote, "About 27% of Cubans earn under $50 per month, 34% earn the equivalent of $50 to $100 per month, and 20% earn $101 to $200. 12% reported earning $201 to $500 a month, and almost 4% said their monthly earnings topped $500, including 1.5% who said they earned more than $1,000. After the Cuban Revolution and before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba depended on Moscow for substantial aid and sheltered markets for its exports. The loss of these subsidies sent the Cuban economy into a rapid depression known in Cuba as the Special Period. Cuba took limited free market-oriented measures to alleviate severe shortages of food, consumer goods, and services. These steps included allowing some self-employment in certain retail and light manufacturing sectors, the legalization of the use of the US dollar in business, and the encouragement of tourism. Cuba has developed a unique urban farm system called
Organoponicos
to compensate for the end of food imports from the Soviet Union. The U.S. embargo against Cuba was instituted in response to nationalization of U.S. citizen-held property and was maintained at the premise of perceived human rights violations. It is widely viewed that the embargo hurt the Cuban economy. In 2009, the Cuban government estimated this loss at $685 million annually. Cuba's leadership has called for reforms in the country's agricultural system. In 2008, Raúl Castro began enacting agrarian reforms to boost food production, as at that time 80% of food was imported. The reforms aim to expand land use and increase efficiency. Venezuela supplies Cuba with an estimated of oil per day in exchange for money and the services of some 44,000 Cubans, most of them medical personnel, in Venezuela. In 2005, Cuba had exports of, ranking 114 of 226 world countries, and imports of, ranking 87 of 226 countries. Its major export partners are Canada 17.7%, China 16.9%, Venezuela 12.5%, Netherlands 9%, and Spain 5.9%. 2012. Cuba's major exports are sugar, nickel, tobacco, fish, medical products, citrus fruits, and coffee, approximately 38% of GDP. According to the Heritage Foundation, Cuba is dependent on credit accounts that rotate from country to country. It was announced in 2008 that wage caps would be abandoned to improve the nation's productivity. Cubans were allowed to build their own houses. According to Raul Castro, they could now improve their houses, but the government would not endorse these new houses or improvements. There is virtually no homelessness in Cuba, and 85% of Cubans own their homes and pay no property taxes or mortgage interest. Mortgage payments may not exceed 10% of a household's combined income. On the 2nd of August 2011,
The New York Times
reported that Cuba reaffirmed its intent to legalize buying and selling of private property before the year's end. According to experts, the private sale of property could transform Cuba more than any of the economic reforms announced by President Raul Castro's government. It would cut more than 1 million state jobs, including party bureaucrats who resist the changes. The reforms created what some call new Cuban economy. In October 2013, Raul said he intended to merge the two currencies, but the dual currency system remains in force. In August 2012, a specialist of the Cuban Energy Company announced the opening of Cuba's first solar power plant. As a member of the Cuba Solar Group, there was also a mention of 10 additional plants in 2013. In May 2019, Cuba imposed rationing of staples such as chicken, eggs, rice, beans, soap and other basics. Some 2/3 of food in the country is imported. A spokesperson blamed the increased U.S. trade embargo, although economists believe that an equally important problem is the massive decline of aid from Venezuela and the failure of Cuba's state-run oil company, which had subsidized fuel costs.
Resources.
Cuba's natural resources include sugar, tobacco, fish, citrus fruits, coffee, beans, rice, potatoes, and livestock. Cuba's most important mineral resource is nickel, with 21% of total exports in 2011. The output of Cuba's nickel mines that year was 71,000 tons, approaching 4% of world production. Its reserves were estimated at 5 million tons, over 7% of the world total. Oil exploration in 2005 by the U.S. Geological Survey revealed that the North Cuba Basin could produce about 2 of oil. In 2006, Cuba started to test drill these locations for possible exploitation.
Tourism.
Tourism was initially restricted to enclave resorts where tourists would be segregated from Cuban society, referred to as enclave tourism and tourism apartheid. Contact between foreign visitors and ordinary Cubans were
de facto
illegal between 1992 and 1997. The rapid growth of tourism during the special period had widespread social and economic repercussions in Cuba, and led to speculation about the emergence of a two-tier economy. Cuba has tripled its market share of Caribbean tourism in the last decade. As a result of significant investment in tourism infrastructure, this growth rate is predicted to continue. Tourists visited Cuba in 2003, predominantly from Canada and the European Union, generating revenue of. Cuba recorded 2,688,000 international tourists in 2011, the third highest figure in the Caribbean behind the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. The medical tourism sector caters to thousands of European, Latin American, Canadian, and American consumers every year. A recent study indicates that Cuba has a potential for mountaineering activity, and that mountaineering could be a key contributor to tourism, along with other activities, e.g. biking, diving, caving. Promoting these resources could contribute to regional development, prosperity, and well-being. The Cuban Justice Minister downplays allegations of widespread sex tourism. According to a Government of Canada travel advice website, Cuba is actively working to prevent child sex tourism, and a number of tourists, including Canadians, have been convicted of offences related to the corruption of minors aged 16 and under. Prison sentences range from 7 to 25 years. Some tourist facilities were extensively damaged on the 8th of September 2017 when Hurricane Irma hit the island. The storm made landfall in the Camagüey archipelago. The worst damage was in the Keys north of the main island, however, and not in the most significant tourist areas.
Geography.
Cuba is an archipelago of islands located in the northern Caribbean Sea at the confluence with the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. It lies between latitudes 19 degrees and 24 degrees N, and longitudes 74 degrees and 85 degrees W. The United States lies 150 kilometers 93 miles across the Straits of Florida to the north and northwest to the closest tip of Key West, Florida, and the Bahamas 21 and NBSP:(KM 13 and NBSP:(me) to the north. Mexico lies 210 kilometers 130 miles across the Yucatan Channel to the west to the closest tip of Cabo Ocotoque in the state of Quintana Roo. Haiti is 77 and NBSP:(KM 48 and NBSP:(me) to the east, Jamaica 140 and NBSP:(KM/87 and NBSP:(me) and the Cayman Islands to the south. Cuba is the principal island, surrounded by four smaller groups of islands: the Colorados Archipelago on the northwestern coast, the Sabanacamagui Archipelago on the north-central Atlantic coast, the Jardines de la Reina on the south-central coast, and the Canarias Archipelago on the southwestern coast. The main island, named Cuba, is long, constituting most of the nation's land area, and is the largest island in the Caribbean and 17th largest island in the world by land area. The main island consists mostly of flat to rolling plains apart from the Sierra Maestra Mountains in the southeast, whose highest point is Pico Turquino. The second largest island is Isla de la Juventud, Isle of Youth, in the Canarias Archipelago, with an area of. Cuba has an official land area of. Its area is including coastal and territorial waters.
Climate.
With the entire island south of the Tropic of Cancer, the local climate is tropical, moderated by northeasterly trade winds that blow year-round. The temperature is also shaped by the Caribbean current, which brings in warm water from the equator. This makes the climate of Cuba warmer than that of Hong Kong, which is at around the same latitude as Cuba but has a subtropical rather than a tropical climate. In general, with local variations, there is a drier season from November to April, and a rainier season from May to October. The average temperature is in January and in July. The warm temperatures of the Caribbean Sea and the fact that Cuba sits across the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico combine to make the country prone to frequent hurricanes. These are most common in September and October. Hurricane Irma hit the island on the 8th of September 2017, with winds of 260 km per hour. At the Camagüey Archipelago, the storm reached Quito de Ávila province around midnight and continued to pound Cuba the next day. The worst damage was in the Keys north of the main island. Hospitals, warehouses and factories were damaged. Much of the north coast was without electricity. By that time, nearly 1 million people, including tourists, had been evacuated. Subsequent reports indicated that 10 people had been killed during the storm, including 7 in Havana, most during building collapses. Sections of the capital had been flooded.
Biodiversity.
Cuba signed the Rio Convention on Biological Diversity on the 12th of June 1992, and became a party to the convention on the 8th of March 1994. It has subsequently produced a national biodiversity strategy and action plan, with one revision, that the convention received on the 24th of January 2008. The revision comprises an action plan with time limits for each item, and an indication of the governmental body responsible for delivery. That document contains virtually no information about biodiversity. However, the country's 4th national report to the CBD contains a detailed breakdown of the numbers of species of each kingdom of life recorded from Cuba, the main groups being, animals 17,801 species, bacteria 270, Chromista 707, fungi, including lichen-forming species 5,844, plants 9,107 and protozoa 1,440. As elsewhere in the world, vertebrate animals and flowering plants are well documented, so the recorded numbers of species are probably close to the true numbers. For most or all other groups, the true numbers of species occurring in Cuba are likely to exceed, often considerably. The numbers recorded so far.
Demographics.
According to the official census of 2010, Cuba's population was 11,241,161, comprising 5,628,996 men and 5,612,165 women. Its birth rate 9.88 births per thousand population in 2006 is one of the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. Although the country's population has grown by about 4 million people since 1961, the rate of growth slowed during that period, and the population began to decline in 2006, due in the country's low fertility rate 1.43 children per woman coupled with emigration. Indeed, this drop in fertility is among the largest in the Western Hemisphere and is attributed largely to unrestricted access to legal abortion. Cuba's abortion rate was 58.6 per 1,000 pregnancies in 1996, compared to an average of 35 in the Caribbean, 27 in Latin America overall, and 48 in Europe. Similarly, the use of contraceptives is also widespread, estimated at 79% of the female